Hey guys, welcome back to my world history lecture. This is going to be my first lecture after the AP test, which was last Monday. So if you guys took that, then I hope you guys did well. I heard about it. I didn't think it was that bad. And normally the world history curriculum goes all the way to present time, but because of the 2020 quarantine situation, the AP tests obviously were a bit abridged and only went up to Unit 6. But I will be just continuing on the rest of the world history unit, and we are picking right where we left off at Unit 7. So all of this would have been on the AP test on any other year except for 2020. And the first topic that we are going to be talking about is the causes of World War I. Now, some of the stuff I say, if you have watched my U.S. history lectures, you might have heard from there as well, because obviously World War I is a U.S. history topic. But in those videos, I really only went into much detail on the American side of World War I, but we will definitely be going into much more detail in world history, as World War I, to be honest, is more of a European war, and where, the U.S. kind of just came in at the last year, going into much more in detail of how World War I started. And just saying, this will probably be a much shorter video than some of my other ones, because just the causes of World War I isn't a big topic, and that should kind of make up for last time's video, which was a bit on the longer side. Anyway, let's get started. So we're going to start with the long-term causes of World War I, and before we even get into the main causes, we need to see what late 1800s Europe was like. So the state of Europe was very interesting. Cooperation was breaking down, and what this means is that a lot of the old leaders, such as Otto von Bismarck, they were dying out, and these old leaders were those who were very supportive of unification and cooperation. However, as these new leaders come in to replace them, these new leaders are no longer interested in keeping the peace. They are actually more interested in showing how tough they are and kind of trying to become the greatest nation and really bring this competitive fervor that wasn't seen with these older leaders, who more respected things like unification. And then another aspect of late 1800s Europe would be the increasing of rivalries, especially in the Balkan regions. We definitely see rivalries increase, and with the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, all of that land, the Ottoman Empire was obviously a huge piece of territory, and when they declined, all of that land is now up for grabs. And that is what the European powers thought, that all of this land was up for grabs. But the people living there, the native indigenous peoples, they kind of wanted their own countries and wanted to remain independent, and therefore they didn't really want other European countries coming in and trying to take it. So that is another example of a conflict arising in Europe. Now, if you watch my U.S. history videos, you would definitely have learned this, but I will go over it again, and it is the four main causes of World War I. Now, these are the long-term causes, and the main is an acronym that stands for, an easy way to remember the four causes, and the causes are militarism, which is the M, alliances, which is the A, imperialism, which is the I, and nationalism, which is the N. And I will be going over all of that. So, starting off with militarism, there was a glorification of armed strength, and the more jingoistic a nation was, the better. That's what, the intent was. And if you guys don't know, jingoism is a word that describes a country's love for war, and this led to other nations feeling threatened and led to other countries building up their militaries as well. So militarism therefore ends up hurting all parties involved rather than helping anyone, because when one nation decides to, go on in this militaristic fervor and start building up their militaries, they begin to pose a threat to other nations, and these other nations in turn build up their militaries as well, and it's kind of a vicious cycle that doesn't really end, and these nations just keep building and building up their militaries without any end in sight, and this leads to war. So that is why militarism is one of the four main long-term causes of World War I. And they thought that only the use of force could solve problems among nations, and there was definitely an idea of survival of the fittest. So the whole idea of social Darwinism and survival of the fittest comes up a lot in history. We saw it. If you saw my U.S. history videos, you saw it with capitalism and how the best companies should outlast the weaker companies. But in this sense, we see a sense of survival of the fittest where a stronger nation should be able to take over a weaker nation. So if a country wasn't necessarily militarily strong, but was taken over by a militarily strong country's right. So if a country wasn't necessarily militarily strong, but was taken over by an actual militarily strong country, it was the militarily strong country's right to take over that land. And if they couldn't do it, then they just weren't meant to do it, because as the survival of the fittest concept lasts, if a country is powerful enough to be able to take over another country, then they deserve it. They are more fit than the weaker country. So, by the process of natural selection, the stronger country should prevail. And an example of this would be Italy not being militarily strong enough to take over Ethiopia, and therefore Ethiopia was able to defeat Italy. So that proves that since Italy was not militarily strong enough, they did not pose the concept of survival of the fittest, and therefore they had no right to take over Ethiopia. And therefore that's why they were unsuccessful as well. Adding on to militarism, European armies also built up their armies using a draft, and this was before World War I in the 19th century. So in the 1800s, they were building up their armies, and as their armies began to mobilize, other nations began to follow suit and mobilize their armies as well to protect themselves. So this is what I was talking about before, about how it's kind of like this cycle that just never ends, because as one European nation's armies begins to mobilize, the other surrounding nations begin to mobilize as well. And as these armies grow bigger and bigger, there just seems to be no end, because as one nation grows bigger, the other nation tries to follow suit, and it's just a vicious cycle. And finally, the last thing about militarism is that as international rivalries increased, countries spend a lot of money on weapons and fortifications. An example of this would be Germany spending a lot of money on their navy because they wanted to be superior and become the strongest nation in the world. And by building a large navy, they make themselves a rival with Great Britain. And if you guys don't know, Great Britain is definitely known for having this massive imperial navy. But by building a large navy, Germany makes themselves a rival with Great Britain. And in response, the Great Britain competes with Germany by increasing their navy as well. So again and again and again, we see this concept of, reciprocating the other nations, whatever the other nations do. So, Germany decides to build a bigger navy, then other rivalry nations will, kind of copy them and follow suit, whether it is because they want to be greater than Germany, or because they feel threatened by them. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, when Germany decides to increase their navy, all of these other countries need to increase their navies as well, whatever their reason may be. So militarism is definitely probably the biggest long-term cause of World War I. Now let's move on to alliances and more importantly, it's the concept of entangling alliances, conflicting alliances that really leads to World War One. And with the unification of Italy and Germany, the distribution of power shifts and new alliances are created. So let's start with the Three Emperors League. Now, this occurred after the Franco-Prussian War, and the Three Emperors League was created between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Now, this was an answer to Otto von Bismarck's greatest fear, which was that France would try to avenge their losses from the Franco-Prussian War. And the goal was to keep France diplomatically isolated and without allies, so Bismarck tried to prevent a Franco-Russian alliance. So the whole point of this is after the French lost the Franco-Prussian War, the German leaders, felt that they really didn't want France getting in their way because they thought that France would, take revenge on them. So what Bismarck did was they pretty much just completely isolated France and try to make sure that the French would be unable to create alliances with other nations that may, come to bite Germany back. And in 1881, Bismarck created this new league, the Three Emperors League, and it was a secret agreement between the three emperors, and the gist was that these nations would remain neutral if any other nations went to war with these emperors. For example, if France went into war with Germany, Russia would have to remain neutral. So this was a way for Germany to ensure that if they were to go into war with France, France would not be getting any help from these other neighboring nations. The next alliance we'll be talking about is the Triple Alliance, which was just the alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Not much to say there. You probably have heard of the Triple Alliance. Then there's the Reinsurance Treaty, and by 1887, the Three Emperors League had ended, so Austria-Hungary and Russia were rivals in the Balkans. And Russia resented Germany's support of Austria-Hungary in the region. So Bismarck made a new treaty with Russia in 1887, and it provided that each nation would remain neutral if the other became involved in a defensive war. So you could definitely see with both the Reinsurance Treaty and the Three Emperors League that there is definitely an effort to kind of keep other nations out of the picture if there were to be another war. And finally, we have the Triple Entente, another alliance that you may have heard of. And the way this was created, it was mostly when France was trying to pull itself out of its diplomatic isolation that Bismarck had put them in. And remember when we were talking about the Three Emperors League just a few moments ago, this is when Otto von Bismarck kind of just completely exiled France into their own little island so that France would not be able to, form alliances and pose a threat to Germany later on. And this was very difficult for France to try to pull itself out of this isolation that Bismarck put them in. But the opportunity does arise when Bismarck is dismissed by Kaiser Wilhelm II, and therefore the reinsurance theory, or the reinsurance treaty elapses. So Russia, who is in need of money, gets that money from France, who is gladly willing to lend some money in order to gain this friendship. And adding on to that Triple Entente, we had the Great Britain, who had been competing both economically and militarily with Germany. So they began to grow weary of Germany. So Great Britain also got involved with this alliance. So basically, we talked about how Germany was trying to, increase their navy. And this was directly in response to Great Britain's navy as well. And, Great Britain finally realizes that, Germany is this bigger threat that we need to worry about. So Great Britain, they kind of want to get the heat off Germany, and so what they do is they get involved in an alliance with France. So if a conflict ever does arise with Great Britain and Germany, Great Britain is hoping that France and Russia will have their backs. So ultimately, Great Britain, France, and Russia all become part of this Triple Entente agreement. And it may seem like a strange agreement for Russia and Britain since they have had their historic problems in the Middle East and disputes over Pacific territories, but they decide to put those differences aside and recognize each other's spheres of influence. At the same time, France and Britain has an understanding with Italy, even though they are in different alliances. So you can see how these conflicting and entangling alliances can pose a threat to world peace. Because if only two nations go to war with one another, it will trigger a huge chain of events that will get the others involved as well. And that is how a world war happens. Because of all these, entangling alliances, there's so many connections everywhere. So if one little spark happens, if one little conflict happens between two nations, then these alliances are it's like they're indebted to the nations that they're in an alliance with to help them, and they're held responsible to help them out. So you get all these nations fighting in the same war. And that's all for alliances. Let's move on to the I, which would be imperialism. And we definitely talked about imperialism before the AP test, but it does come up again. And it is the idea of many different European powers all fighting to get as much land as possible. And so European nations scrambled to partition Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world. And oftentimes they fought because of this. And imperialism definitely comes from just this whole push for, being the largest territory, having the most amount of land. So all of these nations are rivals with one another because they are the ones trying to get the most amount of land. For example, in the 20th century, we have a conflict between France and Germany, and they would often get into conflicts over Moroccan land claims. And this happened multiple times. One time it was like 1901 and another time in 1911, I think. Then finally, we had the N, which is nationalism. And nationalism, historically speaking, developed after France in the Napoleonic Wars, where force and can lead to positive effects. Especially when you're thinking of going to war, then it definitely helps to have that feeling of togetherness or patriotism where all of these similar nationalities are fighting for their own and trying to better themselves. But at the same time, it can also be a very dangerous thing if the leader leads all of their followers into harm and, the followers just blindly, put themselves in means of harm because all they care about is just their nationalism and just bettering themselves. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is the short-term causes of World War I. So one thing that describes the whole World War I happening in the Balkan region would be the Balkan powder keg. And the Balkan region was commonly referred to as a powder keg. And if you guys don't know, a powder keg is pretty much a barrel filled with gunpowder. So, if you have a barrel just filled with gunpowder, as you may imagine, it is definitely susceptible to ignition from just a tiny spark. So that is why the Balkan region was compared to as, because that was kind of what this region was like, with all of the European powers all vying to get a piece of the Balkans. So one country that owns territory in the Balkans is Serbia, who was granted independence in the late 19th century. And they wanted to expand, and they wanted to do so by taking the lands of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The problem was that Bosnia and Herzegovina were owned by Austria-Hungary. And to add on, there were Serbian nationalists living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, so there was definitely a lot of conflict arising from that. And the Serbians wanted to take these nations because they had access to the Adriatic Sea. If you saw a map of all of this, you would know that Bosnia and Herzegovina were bordering the Adriatic Sea. So that's why Serbia wanted these lands so much. And it infuriated Serbia when Austria-Hungary took control of Bosnia and Herzegovina because that would prevent Serbia from, having these lands and having access to the Adriatic Sea. And Russia wants to help Serbia because Russia considers the Serbians to be Slavs, just like themselves. And Russia feels that there should be a unity among Slavs, which was a concept known as Pan-Slavism. And the British were concerned with Russia because the Ottoman Empire could no longer keep Russia in check, which would mess up the balance of power in Russia. So when the Ottoman Empire was still in power, they were the ones that were keeping Russia in check, and they were the ones that were preventing Russia from just dominating all of the lands and taking over everything. But as we know, during this time, the Ottoman Empire is on the decline, and the British knew that the Ottoman Empire would no longer be able to keep Russia in check. So, if Russia were to become, unrestricted, that would mess up the balance of power in Russia. And, the British knew that Russia were trying to get land from Turkey so that they can get control of the Mediterranean Sea. On the other side, we have Kaiser Wilhelm II, and he does not want Russia to get all of this land, so he tries to get the Ottoman Empire in their alliance. He tries to build a railroad that goes from Berlin to the Balkans to Constantinople and then to Baghdad. And that the desire to build this railroad triggers concern from nations like the British, who see this as a threat to their sea route and their Suez Canal. And on the other hand, Russia feels threatened by the railroad because this would let Germany become a strong protector of the Ottoman Empire, and they would never gain their access to the Mediterranean Sea. And that makes sense because, like we said, the Ottoman Empire was the one that was kind of keeping Russia in check and preventing Russia from taking over all the lands, including taking over access to the Mediterranean Sea. However, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of decline, so Russia thought that that was their perfect opportunity to be able to get these lands. However, if Germany was able to build all of these railroads stretching out through the whole Eurasian continent, then that would allow the Ottoman Empire to become powerful again, and the Ottoman Empire would continue to put a check on Russia. So Great Britain and Russia start to strengthen ties with each other, and then Austria-Hungary fears that Pan-Slavism, so they welcome Germany's help. So you definitely can see how all these nations are starting to, draw lines in the sand against one another. And if conflict were to ever arise, all of these nations will become involved, and you could definitely see how that would be problematic and lead to a world war. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the assassination at Sarajevo. Now, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is probably the most infamous reason for why World War I happened. If you were to go to the street and ask someone, name one thing that led to World War I happening, they would probably say, they would never say, oh, it was the four main causes of World War I, unless they took a world history class. They wouldn't say that. What they'd say is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And that is definitely true. June 28, 1914 marks the infamous date where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed. And basically, he was at Sarajevo in a parade, which the intention was to bring together Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Austria-Hungary. However, Gavrilo Princip is the guy in the picture there. He was only 18 years old, and he kills Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And he was working for the Black Hand, which is a Serbian terrorist group. And the story is actually kind of interesting. The Black Hand had a failed assassination attempt in the same parade. They had a bomb on the car that Franz Ferdinand was driving, but it slipped off and it was never able to kill the Archduke. However, so in disappointment that Princip failed this assassination attempt, he just went back to a diner and he was having lunch, And during this time, the car that Franz Ferdinand was in, the driver messed up a turn, and he took the wrong turn. And Franz Ferdinand and Princip, he was just eating lunch, and out the window he sees Franz Ferdinand, so he just barrels out of the door and shoots him, and that is how Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, along with his wife. So that is all we're going to talk about for today. I guess we could do a quick recap. So the state of Europe in 1800, basically cooperation broke down because we did have a trend where old leaders such as Otto von Bismarck were leading this charge for unification. We saw this with the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany. However, as these older leaders are dying out, new leaders emerge, and these leaders are not in the boat of cooperating, but rather they want to expand and imperialize. Then we have the increasing of rivalries. We definitely do see this in the Balkan regions, and as the Ottoman Empire, which was this vast and powerful empire, as they break down, all of their land is up for grabs. So the European powers all want some of their land, which is how rivalries begin to increase. We have the four main long-term causes of World War I. We start with militarism. We had this idea of jingoism, which is one's love for war. And we have this whole idea of survival of the fittest. So, countries that are more militarily powerful, they have the right in their minds to invade on other countries that might be less militarily powerful. And then we have the concept of entangling alliances. So we saw the Three Emperors League, which was created by Bismarck to make sure that France would not get help from any other alliances. And that was their way of diplomatically isolating France after the Franco-Prussian War, so that France would not be able to retaliate after their losses. And basically, the Three Emperors League ensured that if Germany and France were to ever go into war, that the other nations, Russia and Austria-Hungary, would remain neutral and not get involved and help France. Then we had the Triple Alliance, which was the alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then we had the Reinsurance Treaty, which was just another way for Germany to make sure that the neighboring nations such as Russia would remain neutral. And then we had the Triple Entente, which was an alliance between Russia, Great Britain, and France. And although they may have had their differences, especially between Great Britain and Russia, they were able to, set aside their differences to come together in this agreement. Then we have imperialism, which was the drive to take over other nations. And then finally, we have nationalism, which is, the measure of one's love for their own country. Finally, what we just talked about, the short-term causes, we have the Balkan powder keg, which is the whole Balkan region and how unstable it was. And finally, we had the assassination at Sarajevo, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, which was definitely the immediate cause to World War I. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you have any questions, you can leave it in the comments. If not, then I will see you guys next Monday, where we will continue right where we left off with World War I. So if you guys don't have any questions, then thank you guys for watching, and I will see you on Monday.